Well, good morning, everyone. Good evening, if that's your time zone. Good afternoon. Know we have participants from all over the world today to hear the wonderful Professor John Horgan speak about his new book. My name is Lydia Khalil. I'm the convener of the AVERT Research Network, and thank you again for joining us for another webinar in our AVERT Research Network webinar series. As is customary in Australia, where I live and where the network is based, we like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where we meet. And in my case, it's the land of the Wurundjeri people, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. So we have a terrific webinar lined up today from what I am proud to say is a friend of the research networks, Professor John Horgan. Professor Horgan, we were fortunate, in addition to having him be with us on this webinar today and deliver past webinars, was also a keynote speaker for a past symposium talking about fluid ideologies. And if you hadn't had a chance either to attend that webinar or view it, I urge you to go to our website where you can find that talk and hear more from Professor Horgan. But for today, we're focusing, like I said, on his new book, Terrorist Minds, The Psychology of Violent Extremism from Al-Qaeda to the Far Right. Professor Horgan, as you all know, is an esteemed professor at Georgia State University. And with this book, he's bringing together an amalgamation of all of his decades-long expertise and research into this volume. So I'm really excited to hear from him. I won't belabor the introduction because we want to hear from Professor Horgan. I know we have a lot of folks on the webinar today, so I'm sure there will be a number of questions. So before I hand it over to Professor Horgan, just a few housekeeping notes. Please put your questions in the Q&A function, and we will try to get to as many of them as we can. So with that, over to you, Professor Horgan. Thank you so much.
Hey, thank you so much for having me, Lydia. It's wonderful to see you again, and I'm honored to be part of the AVERT network. And yeah, nice to be here. And thank you everyone for tuning in. As Lydia said, good afternoon, good evening, and good night, depending on where you are. It's just after 7 o'clock in the evening here in Atlanta, Georgia, where I work and live. So I have 14 slides that I will present over not more than 20 minutes. I promise I'm not going to exceed that because I have no real intention of hearing myself talk for longer than that. And I really just want to open it up to you as quickly as we possibly can. So let's proceed. So you're going to see lots and lots of pictures of cats and dogs throughout this because I figured if I bore you to death with terrorist psychology, you at least have some nice pictures to look at. So I'm going to keep this very simple. So I want to talk about four things. The first is pretty obvious. I wrote a book. Why did I write a book? That's a very, very good question. I'm not entirely sure, but I have an answer to that. What's it all about, which I suppose should be the main topic of what I share this morning with you. And then where to next? And I've got lots of thoughts on where to next. I mean, I've got my own thoughts on where I would like to go next in terms of some of the sorts of things I've been thinking about recently, some of the things I've been thinking about for the last 20, 25 years. I already have my next book project lined up. Maybe might talk a tiny bit about that tonight if we have time. But I think as far as the psychology of terrorism is concerned, I can say for the first time in my career confidently that the future is very, very bright. I think there are things we have to overcome. There's definitely a few obstacles facing researchers here in the US in terms of, what we need to do in order to achieve the next, to level up, basically. But I think such has been the progress we've seen in this field or subfield over the past decade that we're in a very, very, very good position. So definitely a shout out to any any grad students out there or students thinking about doing a master's or a PhD in this specific area, you are very, very well poised to take advantage of all the progress that's been made in recent years. So, yeah, why do this? Gosh, so I've been writing books for a while now. Some of it kind of comes from a disillusionment about writing articles. You know, articles take a very, very long time to write, and very, very few people actually read them. I suppose you could say the same thing about books, but I want to share some of my motivation for writing this book in particular. It seemed like a very good idea at the time, as those of you who have done master's theses or PhD dissertations or books will know. I mean, it's a big undertaking, a lot of sacrifices involved. It starts out as one thing, and then you do it and get kind of lost and tied up in it, and then it ends up being something else entirely. And then when it comes out and you have this physical thing that you get to hold, it sort of feels like something else entirely again. But I want to, partly for my own edification, it's sort of almost therapeutic, but I want to give you a sense of what was going through my head in putting this thing together, and why also it's going to be the last psychology of terrorism book that I write. So some of it comes from frustration. I wrote a book way back in 2004, which is scarily a long time ago right now. I call it Psychology of Terrorism. And it was my first, sort of serious attempt to put some ideas out there and try to contribute something. And it's one of those things now that if I look at it even squinting, I cringe at just how hard it is to read and how technical it is and how inaccessible the damn thing is. So to any of you who who tried to engage with that book, I simultaneously apologize and thank you for the effort. I've definitely spent the last 20 years trying to learn, or trying to unlearn all the bad writing practices that I'd picked up in my time learning how to become an academic. And in part to sort of reflect on that, I wrote a second edition. So 10 years later, 2014, I went back to my then publisher at Routledge and said, look, I'm not sure I really acquitted myself the first time around. The field has moved on. The first time I wrote this book, I had lots and lots of examples from the IRA. That was an organization I spent a lot of time studying. If this is going to be accessible, if it's going to be a meaningful attempt at sort of retelling the psychology of terrorism story as I see it, I've got to take another stab at this, and I've got to update it, and I've got to and I also got to update it with all of the new research that had been done in the interim, not just by all of my incredible colleagues in this field, but also by me and my lab and others as well. However, nobody, with the exception of maybe 5 people, read the second edition, and I thought, well, can't really blame people for that. I mean, maybe I isolated too many people the first time around with the first book, or as maybe I would think, second edition is just a sort of a barely warmed up version of the first, where you stick a new preface on, a few new examples, and you push it out and say, hey, second new edition, brand new, go get it. The sort of the upshot of all of that, folks, was I decided, recently when I thought about doing this new one, I wasn't going to do a third edition of the Psychology of Terrorism, despite the fact that I had completely rewritten the second edition. But I decided, all right, this is not the way to do that. At some point, I decided a few years ago that I wanted to take another stab at the story, and some of it also came from the realization that I couldn't, in any with any sort of clear conscience, I couldn't recommend my own book to people because I wasn't quite satisfied with my ability to tell the story as best I could. So I thought, let me take one more crack at it and see what I can do. And so I thought, and I had a conversation with a really phenomenal person at Columbia University Press, Kaylin Cobb, who actually approached me about doing a book on incels. And I thought, I want to do a book on incels. It's just not quite the right time for me to do that. I'm still sitting on a lot of data I'm trying to make sense of. But I sort of counter pitched her an idea to say, look, I want to try to tell the same story in a very, very different way, and I want to take a fresh stab at what I think is a representation of the psychology of terrorism. And she said, okay, go with it. Take a crack at it and see what you can do. And so that's what I did. This is absolutely and positively the final time I'm going to try to tell this story. So I genuinely put my heart and soul into it this time around. And I think honestly, this is not like false modesty or anything like that. But it has taken me this long, in my head at least, to figure out what I understand to be the psychology of terrorism. I know that's something that means different things to different people, much like being involved in a terrorist organization. But it's taken me a long time to figure these ideas out in such a way that I think I've told my version of the story as best I possibly can. So I as far as this story is concerned, I cannot do better than this book. The other issue, of course, is that, quite frankly, I had the opportunity to tell this. I don't know if any of you out there are fans of the TV show The Walking Dead, but this view rather, from the Jackson Street Bridge, which is about 100 meters away from where I used to live. I took this about 3 weeks into the pandemic. This image was actually used as the poster for season 1 of The Walking Dead. But this was, this was my reality at the beginning of the pandemic. A virtually abandoned, shut down city, and faced with learning how to, make sourdough or just, binge watch the news, which I was doing, to my detriment. My then girlfriend, now wife, said to me, you need to do something positive if you're going to come through with this with your sanity. So I decided to sit down and try to write this book and just try to tell this story. So that's what I did. So after that long-winded introduction, what's the book all about? Well, it's 3 things, quite simply. I wanted to, mostly for the benefit of students and researchers who want to know about the psychology of terrorism, want to get a foot in the door, want to know about what this stuff is all about. I wanted to synthesize what I think we have learned from 50 or so years of research, specifically by psychologists or researchers who've done psychological research on terrorism. So where we've come from, what progress we've made, et cetera. I wanted to then transition into, giving readers a sense of how things are right now, which again, spoiler alert, I think are very, very positive. And then I wanted to conclude with, manifesto is the wrong word because I think it has obviously different connotations to those of you familiar with this field. But I wanted to really plant a flag in the ground and say, I care very, very deeply about psychology of terrorism, obviously, but I feel that if psychological research on terrorism is to reach its full potential, here are the 1, 2, 3 things we're going to have to do in order to see change there. And I'll certainly talk a bit more about those, but one of those issues is to engage finally in the systematic interviewing of incarcerated terrorist offenders. We are seeing researchers in your neck of the woods, in Australia, in the UK, in Spain, in the Netherlands, in France, in Germany, and elsewhere, make tremendous progress here in ways that we are absolutely not seeing in the United States. I don't say that, you know, to imply any kind of sour grapes or jealousy. I often lord that reality over practitioners and policymakers in this country. But I use it to say that we have an enormous opportunity to have breakthroughs in this field, but we are finally at a point in the research where we don't need more theories. We don't need more conceptual frameworks. We don't need more ways to figure out how to analyze data. We need to actually sit down and engage in large-scale systematic interviewing of offenders on a scale that we haven't done before if we are to break through some of these issues. And there's just no two ways about it. I think we've sort of skirted around that issue for a long time. You know, it's ironic that you know, certainly researchers in the United States have to go overseas, have to go to, in some cases, even to conflict zones and do, you know, pretty prolonged ethnographic research to get these kinds of insights. But I think we are long overdue a return to, you know, ideographic approaches here. I'll say more about that in a second. So very briefly, not to harp on this, but we've come an awful long way. There's no doubt about it. I'm not gonna sort of dwell on that because, you know, it's all of this stuff is well documented. But very briefly, I think we have some of the biggest breakthroughs we've seen in terrorist psychology have been where we were once so focused on offenders, trying to figure out if there was a profile, trying to figure out if there were, you know, things that united them, that simultaneously distinguished them from the rest of us. You know, very offender-focused approaches here. What you know, all very valid questions, but I think what weighed down those perspectives was a presumption about there being static qualities that defined the terrorist. And that led to, for years and years and years, as many of you will know, a sort of a preoccupation with, you know, finding so-called profiles. That eventually gave way to thinking about the terrorist in slightly more sophisticated ways. I think, you know, to make a big nod to the work of people like Emily Corner, it also meant revisiting older discussions about, you know, things like psychological profiling, mental illness, asking far better questions, because, you know, if you don't ask the right questions in this area, you're gonna get, you know, crap or meaningless answers. So we saw some very, very healthy revisiting of some age-old debates and issues with far better questions, far better methodologies, and of course with access to far better evidence. And we've had, you know, far more productive insights as a result. Those kinds of shifts have been monumental as far as just illuminating very exciting new pathways. So you know, to see researchers asking different kinds of questions that have led to different kinds of answers that in turn have led to very, very exciting new avenues for interventions. That's where I have seen tremendous progress in recent times. And I think some of that has come from you know, shifting away from a focus on what offenders are like to examining their behavior, what they do. You know, we're so obsessed with trying to figure out how to think about motivation that we often forget that if we focus more on what people do, it's also an area where we're likely to see far more agreement between observers. You know, as a psychologist, especially as a behavioral psychologist, that seems like a fairly self-evident thing to say, but it's not always that obvious if you look at the research. Two other very exciting shifts that I've seen over the past decade in particular have been a broadening of focus from the offender to the offender's behavior, like I said, but also to the offender's social network, friends, family, co-workers, acquaintances. What are the kinds of things that they are seeing and observing and in an ideal position to report with respect to bystander observations, for example, and a disaggregation. Now, to any of you out there who have, let's say, a background in criminology or criminal justice, you'll know that throughout the history of criminology, we've seen very, very, very big developments occur when we disaggregate different offenders. And criminologists rarely talk about crime and criminals per se, but we talk about certain kinds of criminals, certain kinds of crimes, certain kinds of offenses, et cetera, et cetera. It's only been fairly recently that we've seen that kind of disaggregation being brought to bear on terrorist offenders. So it's rare now in some of the more systematic literature that you'll see, cruder labels like the terrorist being used, as opposed to thinking about the bomber, the recruiter, the follower, the leader, et cetera, et cetera. All of that is to say, I'm sorry, I'm making this more long-winded than it needs to be. We have learned to talk about, and in turn think about, terrorist offenders in a far more specific and nuanced way that has given us a much better appreciation of the diversity inherent in terrorist populations. I like to, I've said to my students for years and years and years, even in the smallest of terrorist groups, there's a variety of roles and functions and jobs into which different kinds of people, find themselves or are put into for different, kinds of reasons, and they have different kinds of experiences. That kind of nuance and disaggregation, I think the implications of it we're still figuring out, but I think there's a lot of promise to be had there. And finally, then, well, where we can go, and I've sort of, I've hinted at that already, but this might be a sort of a criticism that is of limited interest to the bigger, broader international audience, but here in the United States, we have a Bureau of Prisons that has restricted, in other words, prevented access by researchers to terrorist offenders. And there are all kinds of reasons as to why that access is prevented, but we simply are not able to take advantage of the kinds of methodologies we have at our disposal, the kinds of insights we now have about thinking about terrorist behavior, because we simply don't have access to the participants. Of course, it can be done. There are countless examples of many people on this call, I know, who have gone out there and done tremendous field work, ethnographic and otherwise, and researchers who've done a lot of work with former terrorists, people who have come out of incarcerated settings and have been long disengaged from terrorism. But we have extraordinary opportunities to do far more in prison settings, and we are for all the wrong reasons just not doing that. Lack of access to people, I think, is a huge obstacle for psychological approaches to terrorism. And unless we tackle that issue head on in ways that we are reluctant to do right now here, we're just never going to be able to make the kind of progress that we can make. So where to next? Well, look, I think the future is very, very bright. I think it's bright for multiple reasons. I mean, I could talk about this for ages and ages, but I recently benefited from a wonderful example of this. I've just come home from a trip to Sydney, my first time in Sydney. What a beautiful city, where I had the benefit of spending 3 days with academics and practitioners, both having great conversations, both learning from each other. I think there's never, ever been a better time in the history of terrorism studies where we've seen that kind of engagement, and that kind of engagement leads to mutual benefits. And so it's practitioners learning how to think about terrorism in more sophisticated ways. It's academics learning how to talk and think about terrorism in more accessible ways. And I think it's both parties learning about the benefits to be had, even if we just get together in the same room and have conversations, because we're all trying to pull in the same direction here. I think the single most important development in the growth, the maturity of terrorism studies, and in particular, as far as the psychology of terrorism is concerned, is at the graduate level. That's where I'm seeing the huge growth spurt right now. And I can't tell you how excited I am to see more and more and more graduate students do theses and dissertations on terrorism, and not just psychology, but in across the disciplines. But I, of course, because it's my own discipline, I'm just really, really, really blown away at the kind of progress we're seeing in psychology in particular. So it's a maturing field. I mean, look, any of you that are as old as me will know that, when we started doing work on this way back in the mid 1990s, and I was kicking around with people like Andrew Silk and others. We had two terrorism journals. We were total nerds and would wait for our mail copies to come, and we would just devour this stuff. By my count, there are 11 dedicated terrorism journals out now, and most of them are peer-reviewed. Some are open access. We've seen really, really fabulous journals like Journal for De-Radicalization, Perspectives on Terrorism. This stuff is really just taking off. Open access is the only way to go as far as publication is concerned. So to say we're in a maturing field is a understatement. So lots of new challenges, of course, lots of new opportunities. It's never easy to talk about terrorism. I think anyone who is remotely connected with the world, we've been living in over the past several months will know that. I am optimistic about the promise psychology has. I wish there were more. I really wish there were more researchers doing psychological research, but like I said, I'm far more optimistic now than I was even 5 or 6 years ago. So let me stop there. And if any of you, forgive the shameless promotion, but if any of you are somehow encouraged by that word salad, the book is available. You can order it, through Amazon or whatever. But if you go to Columbia's website, you can get a 20% off by using CUP20. And I actually think that code works for any book on their website. So, have at it. So I'll stop there, and thanks for listening. And happy to talk about any of that and more.
Well, thank you so much, John. Thanks for that overview and also your optimism about the future of the field. I think that's really encouraging. You've left us plenty of time for questions, which is excellent. I've got a whole bunch of my own. I urge anyone on the webinar to put some questions in the Q&A. We've already got a couple. But I might kick things off by just taking the host prerogative to ask you a few questions. So, in your overview, your introductory overview, you kind of gave us a good scope of the why and where the field is going. But I'm wondering if I can get you to speak a bit about the meat and the content of the book that you've written. So you say that you talk about in your book about what happens to people as their involvement to terrorism into terrorism deepens. So can you speak a little bit about that? Give us a bit of a preview on your thoughts about
For sure. So I've found it useful, and this is sort of an idea that's come through, the first book, the second book, and now this one. But this one in particular, I think, is where I've taken it as far as it can go. So I've tried to make a couple of core distinctions. So thinking about the psychology of the terrorist, we can think about it in at least 3 distinct ways. We can think about the reasons why people become involved in the first place, and that's sort of more or less characterized as the radicalization process. And there's a ton of research out there, and I think we've made a fairly decent amount of progress on that. There's another set of questions, however, that has to do with what experiences people have as members of terrorist groups or through their involvement in some way. So how involvement changes people, how what are the kinds of things people do as they are thinking about committing a terrorist act, as they are planning it, and so on and so forth. And then there's another set of things that has to do with, another set of factors that have to do with how and why people disengage and or de-radicalize from terrorism. One of the issues that I have really, really struggled with, and I really, really drilled into it in this book, is the fact that I think we have focused on the question of terrorist motivation to the expense of addressing far more practical issues. Now, that's not me disavowing 20 years of my own research or trying to be overly critical about research on radicalization, but it just strikes me that we have really spun our wheels for so long trying to make sense of the radicalization process, trying to identify these qualities, these common themes. I'm not convinced so far that it has given us the tools to effectively prevent terrorism. And the reason I say that is because, encouraged by research of others, and it's some of the research that I've been lucky enough to be involved in, people like Paul Gill and others, I've seen the benefit of shifting the focus from identifying those themes, identifying those qualities of offenders, to instead putting all of that stuff aside for a second and just looking at the basics, the building blocks. What do terrorist offenders actually do? What can we validate through observations that they actually do, and what does that then enable us to do by way of prevention? So some of that research has to do with looking at bystander accounts. We know, for reasons that I still think we don't quite understand, but we know that there is an enormous leakage effect when it comes to certain kinds of terrorists. So many terrorist offenders, especially lone actors, will divulge key plot points and divulge key elements of their plots to friends, family, peers, co-workers. And we know that information isn't always passed on to the authorities. But that is the kind of information that, is to me, provides the building blocks for prevention. That is the kind of information we can look at and mine and use for preventative programming in a way that we could never, ever draw on if we stay focused on trying to answer questions about radicalization. So that is not to say that I'm, not in favor of us continuing to do more research on those topics, but I think sometimes we can just get so misdirected for reasons we think are noble, while completely forgetting that we could ask questions about motivation all day long, and it still wouldn't necessarily bring us any closer to doing the practical things we need to do to prevent terrorism from taking place.
So you say let's focus on what terrorists do rather than what motivates them. And so you pointed to this issue around leakage, right? Is there anything else that you can point to that your research and others' research says about what they do even before they get to that plotting stage?
Well, we know what they do. So we know that they develop, grievances. We know that they experiment. We know that they flirt with different ideologies. All of that now, ironically, is becoming more apparent because offenders are leaving an ever greater digital footprint. I'm not sure that those sorts of behaviors necessarily, easily point out places for intervention, because, quite frankly, the noise associated with that is voluminous. I think ironic, and perhaps more pessimistically for the point of prevention, we have to wait a little bit further along before we can, sort out the signal from the noise, as it were. But we know now from over a decade of very compelling research, we're seeing leakage not just in terrorist offenders, but we're also seeing that replicated across non-ideological offenders, school shooters, mass shooters of different shades and stripes and ideologies, as it were. It's no longer an issue that intent is not being seen We know it's just that this leakage is not being reported. So for me, it's led to a fundamental shift in how I think about the problem. My focus now is, through research I'm doing right now with my lab and other partners across the country, we're trying to figure out what we can do to better encourage the reporting of this behavior, because that's where we're going to see results. It's where we're going to see the kind of results that we could never ever hope for if we only focus on issues of motivation. And I'm not saying, we gotta throw out the baby with the bathwater, as it were. Motivation is important. It's important to know where trends are rising or falling. It's important to know about the allocation of resources. It's important from a policy perspective. But in terms of on-the-ground prevention, in terms of what I need to do to promote reporting in my community for seeing these signs, I think we could be talking about motivation all day long, and we would never get to addressing that issue, which is I need to figure out what are the obstacles to somebody picking up the phone or opening an app and saying, I'm seeing this behavior. What do I do about it?
So that's in the prevention space. We've got a question in terms of what the implications are for risk and threat assessment. So it centers around how much of risk and threat assessment tools still focus on this issue around motivation and ideology. And the question asks, what do you make of that? But also, I might add, how given what you just discussed, how can we shift risk and threat assessment tools to take into account this behavioral issue?
I'm not sure I understand the question. How can we shift the tools to accommodate?
So the risk and threat assessment tools are very much focused on what offenders believe, what their motivations are, what their ideologies are. If we shift the focus to behavior, how will that impact our threat and risk assessment tools?
Well, I think all right. So I want to make clear what I'm saying. We've got to focus on different things at different points in the process. The person who is conducting a risk assessment is almost certainly not going to be interested in the kinds of things that need to be done to get a community to feel safe and about reporting suspicious behavior. When it comes to conducting a risk assessment, then by definition, someone is already on the radar of a practitioner. I think what has caused a lot of confusion in recent times is a rather confused understanding about the meaning of ideology to a person. Some of that has also been compounded by the fact that we seem to be seeing more and more cases of what different researchers call anything from salad bar ideologies to ideological convergence, ideological drift, or something like that. We're seeing more and more cases where it's becoming harder and harder to categorize ideological affiliation into this bucket or that bucket. In the good old days, you could easily categorize and think of offenders as extreme left or extreme right or jihadist or something else. That seems to be changing in ways that I don't think any of us truly understands. I'm not convinced that most risk assessment instruments, because I think the person doing the assessment is the most important tool in all of this. I don't think the instruments necessarily are well equipped to capture what those changes mean, because risk is never a constant. It's always shifting.
So in terms of the methodology around the need to interview and to talk with more of these individuals, right? So we have a question that asks about, do you feel as strongly about talking with terrorists who are no longer detained or who are never detained? So is the potential to yield knowledge the same or better or less outside of the prison environment? And would there be a different approach in interviewing subjects outside of the prison environment versus inside the prison environment?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, for sure. I mean, so, there are all kinds of, there's, different protections. So I'm a psychologist, I'm a social scientist. Every single thing that I do, even writing a letter to someone, goes through what's called an IRB process, an institutional review board. So there are protections for people who participate in this research. So the principles, I'm not going to go through all the ethical principles, but informed consent and the right to withdraw and all the rest of it. There's an awful lot we can learn from people who have been through it. There's no doubt about it. But I think we have a population of terrorist offenders here in the United States. I'll give an example. I've corresponded with people who are in custody, and they will say, well, if you want to do something more systematic, we can talk, we can do these interviews. But prison officials don't allow researchers into these settings. So, there are many, I won't say a lot, there are many former terrorists who are willing to be available to researchers, but many of them, quite frankly, have been out of violent extremism, 10, 15, 20 years. I think they probably themselves would admit that they have a limited shelf life in terms of their interest in even sharing the same stories. But I think we're not doing nearly enough to reap the benefits of cooperative interviewees. These are people who, for all kinds of reasons, all kinds of motivations, want to talk to researchers. But for structural reasons, we just can't do it. And prison environments provide, a setting that has, other natural benefits as well, because we can have access to control groups. We can compare different kinds of member, even in the same group. People like Jeff Victoroff talked about this, 10, 15 years ago. We need to do better to disaggregate and stratify the kinds of offenders we're talking about. Well, prison settings can give you a great opportunity to compare and contrast the recruiters from the bombers, to the fundraisers, to et cetera, because that's one of the things that I think we know very, very little about when it comes to terrorist psychology. How and why do some people want to become bombers versus others want to become, recruiters or something else? Are those roles, are people predisposed to those roles because of their because of whatever education, background, experience? Do they gravitate to those roles? Do they learn on that? We know next to nothing about that. And prison environments would give us an extraordinary opportunity to learn so much more about those sorts of issues.
Just a follow-up question around those different roles. So we're getting more nuance, recognizing the different roles of people that people play in terrorism. So can you talk a bit about what implications you think that would have in terms of intervention? So if we know people take on different guises or different roles, would the intervention or prevention, but specifically intervention, look differently?
Short answer is I don't know. It might. It might be that instead of asking questions about, let's say, how do we how do we deglamorize involvement in a particular group? It might be that we start asking questions like, well, why is it that some people want to become frontline fighters versus other people want to become, or the people are just quite happy to send on money? I used to think back in the day that, it's sort of cliche, right? But I used to say, well, yeah, okay, theoretically, anybody in the right circumstances, the right motivation could be a terrorist. I don't think that anymore, because I know from listening to people's accounts, some people drift into this world with ideas of, whether it's delusions of grandeur or something else, but with ideas of glory and sacrifice, and then they realize 5 minutes in, I've made a terrible mistake. Just to quote Joe Bluth, I need to back out of this really, really quickly, and maybe then I'll do something else. So I don't know of anyone who just wants to become a terrorist. So people have very specific ideas, we could say fantasies, about what involvement looks and feels like to them, and I don't think we have enough of a nuanced understanding of what the individualized pathways, the individualized attractions look and feel and smell like, because we're not doing nearly enough to listen to what to what former terrorists are saying about what specifically drew them to the group. So some of it's about asking better questions, but it really is about trying to find out what, if anything, distinguishes the fundraisers from the bombers, from the facilitators, from the the rest of them. So I think that's a big future direction that we can explore.
So I think you answered a lot of this in your previous answer just now, but we did have a question about asking, how do you account for those who demonstrate leakage but never end up actually attempting an act of terrorism? So you spoke a little bit about how people's perception of what involvement will look like, and then they kind of back away. But is there anything else you can add to help answer that question?
Off the top of my head, no. So, I mean, are you talking about people who say, well, on Friday, I'm going to go down there and do this thing, and then they don't do it?
That's right, yeah.
Well, I'd want to know, okay, so you're not going to do it on Friday, but are you going to do it on Monday? I mean, so what's going on there? Or is the implication that some kind of intervention has happened, an informal intervention is, I mean, I just don't know.
Well, perhaps
And I'm forgive me, I'm not sure I'm specifically answering this question, but I have no doubt that there are people who, they have the grievance is festering, they're preparing, they're committed to an act, and for whatever reason, they decide they're not going to go through with it. There's probably diversity even within that group. So because in that cohort rather, because it might be that stopping or not going through with the act is itself the fantasy fulfilled, so knowing that I can do it, I can get away with it, but I'm not going to do it. I just wanted to see if I could get this far. There's also no shortage of evidence from manifestos. We have a big school shooters project ongoing right now in my lab at Georgia State. We're working with our College of Education and others, and we're pouring through the manifestos of school shooters. And we're seeing many cases of school shooters who will say they'll have online diaries, and they will put all of this information in there, and they'll say things like, well, I'm not sure I want to go through with it, but let's just let it lie for a couple of weeks and see what happens, and then they eventually go and go through with it. So I think there are multiple different pathways that people can take, but there's probably also a cohort of people out there that go that far, think about it, and decide to back away and never do anything again. And why or how they would eventually come to people's attentions, I'm not sure.
Mm. So we have another question going back to this idea that the focus should be around the communities and networks around individuals involved in violent extremism and terrorism, and to encourage disclosure. But the question asks, is there a risk that communities who are encouraged to disclose more information about risk behaviors could end up losing cohesion and social capital?
Yeah, of course, absolutely. Yeah,
And
no
are.
doubt about it. Yeah, and we've seen that wholesale. We saw that. I mean, I'll just give you an example from the United States. I mean, where policy responses in the post 9/11 era were absolutely disastrous. We had Muslim communities across the United States being profiled en masse and being demonized, and we had these all but Islamophobic rhetoric from policymakers about, well, what is the Muslim community doing to step up? Well, that's the kind of response you typically don't hear when it comes to far right extremists. So the hypocrisy and the inconsistency is rife to see for anyone who pays attention to CVE or PCVE or whatever it is we're going to call it. My point is that the challenge of encouraging reporting and encouraging community cohesion is going to be the same no matter what we call it. We can call it, whether we call it PCVE or something else, or targeted violence and terrorism prevention, the challenge is still the same. And we a lot of agencies in the United States have had to work very, very, very hard to rebuild that sense of trust, to rebuild that sense of cohesion over the past decade. I think we've seen a lot of progress, but there's always work to be done. In some of the work that we've done on bystander intervention, I mean, we've done focus groups with young people, peers of some violent extremists who have said, even though even if I am well positioned to spot the signs of radicalization, yeah, I wouldn't report to authorities.
Mm.
And my assumption there was that, well, it's maybe it's hatred of the police, or it's perhaps fear of being demonized, or fear of being profiled. And it turns out that fear is a very, very common thread in people's reasons why they are reluctant to report. Fear of the repercussions of, well, get myself into trouble, get my family into trouble, I might get my friend into trouble. So we're having academics and practitioners and policymakers alike, and communities, more to the point, real serious, detailed discussions now about what we can do to encourage safe, anonymous, and secure reporting in a way where the people doing the reporting feel safe. And that's easier said than done, but that's where I think we're seeing tremendous progress.
Mm. So we've had lots of questions come in. We probably only have time to answer, one or two.
I'll be short in my answers, I promise. I'll try to do better.
Well, it's a testament to kind of the interest into this work and the broadness of the discussion. But this question focuses on the nexus between terrorism and mental health disorders. And it asks, what weight should we afford mental health in explaining an offender's motivation or behavior?
Listen, I'll give you, you're going to say typical academic, right? I mean, it depends.
Depends, yeah.
It depends. I mean, these are, we have the literature, for whatever it's worth, but the literature and the thinking here has moved way beyond this simple, are terrorists mentally ill or are they not? I think in the past there were some very, very crude characterizations of, of that type. And, mental illness cannot explain terrorism, but to say that mental illness isn't relevant to terrorism is grossly misleading. We have seen people who have had mental illness drift into terrorism. Now we've seen people with mental illness drift into particular kinds of terrorism, which is very interesting. We have also seen something that people like Daniel Kohler and others have illustrated. Mental illness can be a consequence of involvement in terrorism. One of my PhD researchers, Katerina Meredith, is doing some extraordinary work on the experiences of people who have been in violent extremist movements, and mental health and trauma can be profound consequences of prolonged involvement in these groups. So I think I think all of those are relevant, and I saw some of this emerge in press coverage around the attacks that you saw in your country recently around, well, is this ideological or is it mental illness? These are not mutually exclusive issues.
Hmm. So two questions, I might combine them, kind of related to your last answer there. One is about media depictions of terrorists and terrorism, and how that's influenced both kind of the academic research into terrorism, but also public perceptions. I know you spoke in your book about how via social media we've kind of all become participants in this phenomenon of terrorism, is right, because it is a communicative act, terrorism, and there's much more communication to be had. So there's that part of the question relating to the role of media and social media. The second question relates to debates, again, about what is terrorism, but it specifically asks, there's been calls for people to focus on the behavior. So if it's terrorizing behavior, if it's terrorizing the community, then it should be called terrorism, irregardless of any discernible ideological motivation. And I suppose that gets into some of the research, particularly out of the US, on targeted violence and taking a look at mass shooters as well. into this. So maybe we can wrap up by kind of your thoughts on those two issues.
I love that you're wrapping up on like two of the hardest questions, but quick answers for now. And I do say this not to evade it, but I do talk about this an awful lot in the book. So, no, I profoundly disagree with characterizing acts of even mass violence without an ideological dimension to it as terrorism. So yes, we can feel terrorized. Yes, we can feel vulnerable. Yes, we can ask ourselves if I or my family or anyone else that I love could be next. But absent an ideological dimension, it cannot be terrorism. That should in no way reduce the seriousness with which we look at the act or with which we talk and think about prevention. But we need to, and people will say, when we've seen this over here wholesale, call it what it is. Well, I am calling it what it is. I mean, one of the hardest things about studying terrorism is that if you have a definition of it, you are going to be tested very, very frequently on whether you're willing to stand by that definition. And so, we had a shocking, I mean, they're all shocking, but a profoundly traumatizing event in October of it was 2017, 2018, a mass shooting in Las Vegas. And it looked and felt and sounded like a terrorist event, but there was no ideological dimension to it. And so it was something else. Yeah, media depictions are simplistic. I think as academics, I mean, we have a role to play in dispelling some of those myths. We can't control what journalists do, but I think we also can do a better job of characterizing and communicating our research to the bigger, broader audience, which is partly why we try and write books and do talks and things like that. I mean, terrorism today has profoundly changed. I mean, it's an equal opportunities employer. We see men, women, children, all ages, all backgrounds, all religions, all grievances become involved in through multiple pathways. They end up doing different things. They end up having different experiences, and they end up coming out the other end fundamentally changed people. I think the internet has been the true game changer as far as the changing stereotype, the changing profile, all of that. So, yeah, I mean, and those stereotypes they're silly and they're embarrassing. We saw that all throughout the history of ISIS. What are those terms? If jihadi brides and veiled threats and all of that nonsense. I mean, it's offensive and silly and ridiculous. And and I think we're not going to, as an academic, I'm not going to sit here and sort of blame the media. I sort of ask, well, what can I do as a researcher to communicate that nuance, to communicate those changing trends and demographics in a way that might have an impact the next time around? So.
Well, John, thank you so much, for your time this morning. You've given us a mission. Apologies to all the questions that we didn't get a chance to go over this morning, but it's all the more reason to pick up a copy of Terrorist Minds, Columbia University Press. I bet that many of those questions will be answered in the book and many more. Thank you very much, John, for being with us today, for your time, and we look forward to seeing you all at the next AVERT webinar. I also want to make a quick plug for our upcoming AVERT International Research Symposium. Our call for proposals is now out. You can find it on our LinkedIn page and on our website, and you can find that at avert.net.au. We hope as many of you can to submit proposals to attend, to engage with us on our symposium, which is a great research and practitioner focused event that happens every year. Thank you once again, Professor Horgan, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
My pleasure. Thanks so much, Lydia. Thanks everyone for tuning in. I really, really appreciate it. Take care.
Bye for now.
Bye-bye.